Iron River, Wisconsin, October 1888. The air, already sharp with the coming frost, carried the rhythmic sounds of settlement, the thud of an axe, the scrape of a saw, and the murmur of men who knew their work. But from the edge of the new cutover, a different sound drifted, a metallic scratch, a hiss, and the acrid smell of hot flux. It was here that Friedrich Vogt was building his folly. The men from the lumber camp would stop on their way back to the bunkhouse, leaning on their tools to watch the strange German. He had raised a standard 22-foot log cabin, solid and square, the kind of shelter any one of them would have been proud to chink. But he hadn't stopped there. Now he was meticulously wrapping the entire structure in gleaming sheets of galvanized tin, the kind used for cheap buckets and roofing patches. Mortimer Crenshaw, the lumber camp timekeeper, a man whose life was ruled by ledgers and straight lines, shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Look at that," he said to a knot of sawyers, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "Vogt's building himself a sardine can." Laughter followed, rough and easy. The men saw a waste of money and a profound misunderstanding of a Wisconsin winter. Logs needed to breathe, they said. That tin would sweat on the inside, rot the wood before the spring thaw. It was foolishness, plain and simple. Another case of an immigrant bringing old-world ideas that had no place in the brutal reality of the northern forests. Vogt, hearing them, never turned. He just wiped a line of solder with a damp rag, watching the seam cool to a dull, perfect silver line, impervious and absolute. He was not building a wall of logs, he was building a defense, and the mockery of men who had not yet felt the true teeth of the cold was just another sound in the wind. What did this German sheet metal smith, this Klempner from the Schwarzwald, understand about the physics of vapor and the true nature of insulation that the most experienced log builders in the upper Midwest had missed entirely? The answer to that question would be written across the landscape in ice and agony, in survival and sorrow, before the winter was through. It was a lesson that would change how people built their lives in this unforgiving country. And if you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of thermal dynamics that Friedrich Vogt carried in his hands. A principle that is the very foundation of modern building science today. Let me know in the comments below, what's the strangest, most counterintuitive solution you've ever seen that actually worked? If you appreciate stories of quiet ingenuity and the triumph of practical knowledge, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support allows us to uncover more forgotten histories of frontier innovation. Friedrich Vogt was not a carpenter. He was not a logger or a farmer. He had never hewn a dovetail joint or read the grain of a pine log to predict its split. In his homeland, the Black Forest of Germany, he was a Klempner. His hands knew the language of metal, not wood. They understood the precise angle for a copper flashing to shed a century of rain, the exact heat needed to sweat a zinc gutter joint into a single, seamless channel. His world was one of standing seam roofs, designed to withstand the driving, wet sleet of the high alpine passes, of soldering irons and charcoal braziers, of mallets that shaped without breaking. He thought not in terms of mass and bulk, but of skins and seams. He had come to America with his wife Anneliese and their two small children, Klaus and Marta, seeking land and a life defined by their own labor. They arrived in Wisconsin the previous autumn, full of hope that curdled into a cold, hard knot of fear during their first winter. They had spent it in a hastily erected cabin, a structure considered perfectly adequate by local standards. But adequacy, Friedrich quickly learned, was a word that meant something different at 10 degrees above zero than it did at 30 below. That first winter had been a relentless education in the physics of misery. He learned that cold was not a passive state, but an active, invasive force. It found every flaw. He remembered the beard ice, the frozen condensation from their own breath, growing so thick on the inside of the door that when he pulled the leather latch strap one morning, it snapped with a crack like a gunshot. He remembered dipping a ladle into the water bucket and having the frozen metal handle pull a patch of skin from his wet thumb, leaving a raw, weeping wound that refused to heal for a week. He remembered the night the cold was so absolute, the metal of the stovepipe contracted so violently that the flue damper rang shut on its own hinge with a mournful clang that woke them all from a shivering sleep. Annalise had spent most of that winter huddled by the stove with the children, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pinched and pale. Friedrich had vowed, with a quiet intensity that was his nature, that they would never endure such a winter again. His family's survival was not a matter of opinion or tradition. It was a problem of engineering. The problem, as Friedrich saw it, was not the log cabin itself. The conventional wisdom was sound as far as it went. A thick log wall was a decent barrier against the cold. The failure was more subtle. The true enemy wasn't just the temperature, it was the moisture the wind carried. In Iron River, the standard cabins, like the one belonging to the O'Malley family next to the creek, or the Svenssons on the rise, all suffered the same fate. Their owners were engaged in a constant losing battle against infiltration. The wind, carrying microscopic ice crystals and damp air, was a relentless engine of heat transfer. It didn't just blow around the cabin. It blew through it. It forced its way into the chinking between the logs. No matter how carefully it was packed with mud and moss, every gust of wind was a pump, pushing warm air out and dragging frigid, damp air in. But the greater crime, the one Friedrich understood with the certainty of his trade, was what that moisture did to the logs themselves. A dry log is a magnificent insulator. Its cellular structure is full of tiny, trapped air pockets, and still air is one of the best insulators there is. But when wind forces dampness into the wood fibers, those air pockets fill with water. Water, compared to air, is a thermal superhighway. A log with a moisture content of 30% loses nearly 3/4 of its insulating capacity. It ceases to be a barrier and becomes a bridge, actively conducting the precious warmth from inside the cabin out into the frozen landscape. The settlers were living inside walls that were betraying them, wicking away the heat from the very fires they were so desperately feeding. They saw the symptom, the need for more wood, always more wood, but they did not see the cause. They were trying to heat a house with a wet sponge for a wall. Friedrich watched them, saw the strain on their faces, the ever-dwindling wood piles, and knew their approach was wrong. They were fighting the cold. He intended to seal it out. His project began in late September. First, he covered the entire log structure, from the stone foundation to the roofline, with sheets of thick, tarred building paper. He overlapped each sheet by a full 6 inches, creating a continuous, dark sheath. The neighbors saw it as a strange, funereal shroud. Friedrich saw it as the first layer of defense, a simple barrier to block the worst of the wind. Then came the tin. He had spent a significant portion of their savings on crates of 2-foot by 8-foot galvanized sheets, delivered by wagon from Duluth. He worked with a quiet, methodical precision that baffled the onlookers. He hung the first sheet, ensuring it was perfectly plumb. The next sheet overlapped the first by exactly 1.5 inches. This was the seam, the crucial element. Using a small charcoal brazier to heat his soldering irons, he set to work. He would clean the edge of the metal, apply a smear of acidic flux that hissed and smoked, and then draw the hot tinned point of the iron down the length of the seam. A bead of silver solder would flow behind it, cooling almost instantly into a bond that was not just strong, but hermetically sealed. It was this process that drew Mortimer Crenshaw's most pointed criticism. As timekeeper, Crenshaw understood stress and load. He saw the weight of the tin sheets and imagined the far greater weight of ice that would soon cling to them. He made his pronouncement in the camp office, a place of authority. "He's wasting his time and his silver," Crenshaw declared to anyone who would listen. "That solder is for patching buckets, not holding a wall together. Come the first good ice storm, the weight of it will pop those little seams like buttons off a shirt. Mark my words, he'll find 40 feet of tin peeled back onto the snow by January." The logic was sound, based on every bit of frontier experience. Ice was a powerful lever. Everyone had seen it split rock and heave foundations. The idea that this German's delicate silver lines could resist it seemed absurd. When a logger named Peterson repeated Crenshaw's prediction to Friedrich himself, the smith merely glanced up from his work. "The seam is for water," he said, his German accent thickening the simple words. "The nails hold the weight. The seam will hold." Then he turned back to his brazier, leaving the man confused. The mockery lasted through October. The validation would last a lifetime. To understand the genius of what Friedrich Vogt was doing, you have to understand the three ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. The settlers understood conduction. They knew a thick wall was better than a thin one. They had a rough, intuitive grasp of radiation. They knew to stand near the stove to feel its warmth. But they fundamentally underestimated the role of convection, specifically the movement of air, and its accomplice, moisture. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was the air that carried the cold, and the water vapor that air carried with it. A cubic foot of air at 30 degrees Fahrenheit is a tiny, insignificant thing, but billions of them, driven by a 20-mile-per-hour wind, represent a massive and continuous theft of heat. This is convective heat loss. The standard log cabin, with its thousands of tiny, invisible gaps in the chinking, was a sieve for air. The settlers felt it as a draft, a cold spot, a flicker of the candle flame. They were trying to warm a room that was constantly being flushed with new, frozen air. Vogt's tin skin addressed this head-on. The lapped, soldered seams created a building envelope that was, for all practical purposes, airtight. Air simply could not move through the wall. He had eliminated convective heat loss at a single stroke, but that was only half the equation. The more critical achievement was controlling moisture. As we discussed, a wet log is a poor insulator. The scientific measure for insulation is R value. A dry, seasoned pine log has an R value of about 1.4 per inch of thickness. An 8-inch log wall, therefore, should have an R value of around 11. But when that same log becomes saturated with wind-driven ice and moisture, its R value can plummet to less than 3. The wall effectively stops being an insulator. Vogt's tin sheathing was a perfect vapor barrier. It presented an impenetrable face to the wind. No moisture could reach the logs. The tar paper beneath it was a secondary barrier, and the half-inch air gap between the paper and the tin provided a final, crucial buffer. The logs of his cabin would remain bone-dry all winter long, preserving their maximum natural R value. While his neighbors were living inside cold, damp conductors, Friedrich Vogt's family would be sheltered by a warm, dry insulator. He hadn't just wrapped his cabin in metal. He had locked its insulating power in and locked the weather out. He had built a fortress not of strength, but of integrity, one perfect, unbroken seam. That November, the winter came not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, brutal assault. A weather pattern the old-timers called a northern forest inversion settled over the region. For 11 straight days, the temperature never rose above 30 degrees below zero. At night, it plunged to 34 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no wind, no snow, just a dead calm, heavy cold that pooled in the cutover like a physical substance. The silence was absolute, broken only by a sound that terrified newcomers: the sharp crack of pine trees, their sap freezing and expanding with such force that the trunks split open. The sound was like a rifle shot, and it echoed through the 2 a.m. darkness, waking men in their bunks and reminding them of the immense, indifferent power of the cold. For the families in the Iron River settlement, it was a siege. Life contracted to the small circle of warmth around the wood stove. The daily task of survival became a grim calculus of fuel against time. The O'Malleys burned through a cord of wood in 4 days, their children huddled together, coughing in the drafty air. At the Svensons, the windows were thick with a frost so opaque it turned noon into twilight. They hung blankets over the doorways, but the cold still crept in, a palpable presence. Mortimer Crenshaw, in his well-built timekeeper's office, kept his stove glowing cherry red, yet the ink in the well on his desk froze solid. He had to thaw it on the stovetop every hour to make his entries. The camp was in a state of quiet, desperate hibernation, but inside the tin-wrapped cabin, a different reality unfolded. The cold was a distant fact, not an immediate threat. Friedrich had to feed his small stove, but only a few logs at a time. The heat, once generated, stayed. It radiated from the stove and was held by the dry, efficient log walls. The air was still and calm. There were no drafts. The windows had only a delicate filigree of frost at the very edges, and through the clear centers, they could watch the frozen world outside. Annalise baked bread, and the warm, yeasty smell filled the small space, a smell of life and normalcy that had vanished from every other home. The children, Klaus and Marta, sat at the small wooden table, drawing on a slate with their bare hands, their fingers nimble and warm. Friedrich, watching them, felt a profound, quiet satisfaction. His hands, which had known only metal, had built a sanctuary of warmth from a principle as simple and unyielding as a soldered seam. The breaking point for the camp came on the 9th day of the inversion. A young French-Canadian timber beast named Baptiste, working a far section, had gotten his hand caught between 2 logs. By the time they got him back to his bunk, 2 of his fingers were white and hard with frostbite. The camp foreman, a practical man named Sullivan, knew that without immediate care, the boy would lose them. The only person in camp with any medical supplies beyond whiskey and bandages was Crenshaw, who kept a stock of ointments and salves for injuries. Sullivan dispatched the timekeeper at dawn. "Mortimer, take the frostbite ointment to Baptiste's cabin, and be quick about it. The boy's in a bad way." Crenshaw bundled himself in layers of wool and canvas and stepped out into the crushing cold. The air was so frigid it felt sharp in his lungs. His route took him past Friedrich Vogt's property. As he trudged through the deep powdery snow, he saw the familiar shapes of the settlement's cabins, each one looking like a natural feature of the landscape, bearded with a thick white coat of hoarfrost. The frozen breath of the families inside, combined with the microscopic humidity of the air, had condensed on the cold log walls, creating a crystalline shell 3 inches thick. It was the mark of a Wisconsin winter, a sign of a house fighting a losing battle with the cold. He braced himself for the sight of Vogt's cabin, expecting to see his prediction made real. He imagined the tin sheets sheathed in a monstrous armor of ice, the seams groaning, perhaps already split open. What he saw instead stopped him in his tracks. The tin cabin was clean. Under the pale dawn light, the galvanized metal was bare, a dull gray against the white snow. There was no ice, no frost, not even a dusting of rime. It stood stark and artificial, utterly untouched by the phenomenon that had coated every other structure in the camp. He approached it slowly, a sense of disbelief warring with the evidence before his eyes. It made no sense. This metal skin should be the coldest thing in the forest, a perfect surface for frost to grow upon. He reached out a gloved hand, then hesitated. He pulled the glove off with his teeth, his bare skin stinging in the air. He expected to touch a surface so cold it would instantly bond to his flesh. He laid his palm flat against the tin at chest level. The sensation was a shock. It was not warm, not like the stove back in his office, but it was not the biting, aggressive cold of frozen metal. It was merely cool, a neutral temperature like a stone pulled from a cellar. It was dry. He ran his hand over one of the long vertical solder seams. It was smooth, perfect, and just as free of frost as the rest of the wall. He pressed his ear to the tin and heard nothing, only a profound silence. No whistle of wind, no creak of struggling wood. Then he saw the final, irrefutable proof. On the windowsill, visible through the clear glass, sat a simple ceramic bowl. It was Annalise's supper bowl, left to cool. He could see the contents, a stew of cabbage and pork. He watched, transfixed, as Friedrich Vogt came to the window from inside. The German picked up the bowl, and as he did, he gave it a slight nudge. The broth at the center of the bowl trembled. It was still liquid. Crenshaw stared, his mind reeling. He thought of his own inkwell, frozen solid a few feet from a red-hot stove. He thought of the stew in Baptiste's cabin, which he knew would be a frozen quoit of ice and meat that you could hold up by the bones sticking out of it. And here, on an exposed windowsill at 34 degrees below zero, was a bowl of soup that was still soup. In that moment, Mortimer Crenshaw understood. The mockery, the confident predictions, the certainty of his own experience, it all collapsed into dust. He wasn't looking at a foolish mistake. He was looking at a masterpiece. He delivered the ointment to Baptiste, his mind elsewhere. Later that day, after the sun had risen to its useless perch in the white sky, he walked back to Vogt's cabin. Friedrich was outside splitting a few logs from his modest woodpile. He worked with an unhurried, efficient rhythm. Crenshaw stood for a moment, just watching. The German looked up and nodded, his expression impassive. "Vogt," Crenshaw began, his voice raspy, "I was wrong." It was a difficult admission for a man like him. "I told everyone your seams would fail, that your cabin was a joke." Friedrich simply stacked a piece of wood. "It is not a joke." "No," Crenshaw said, shaking his head. "It's not." He looked at the stark metallic walls, seeing them now not as a container, but as a boundary. He searched for the right words to capture the revelation he'd had. He thought of the thick, frosted walls of his own office, walls that felt heavy and suffocating. Then he looked at the clean, sharp lines of the tin. "I thought you built a tin can," Crenshaw said, his voice quiet with awe. "But I was wrong. You didn't build a wall. You built a dry sky around your house." The conversion of Mortimer Crenshaw was as swift as it was total. He was a man of ledgers and facts, and the fact was that Vogt's family was warm and safe while others were suffering. His endorsement, delivered with the quiet authority of a man admitting a profound error, carried immense weight in the camp. He explained what he had seen: the bare metal, the liquid stew, and the laughter that had followed Friedrich all autumn died out, replaced by a grudging, then open, respect. When the great cold finally broke, families began to visit the Vogt cabin, not to mock, but to learn. Friedrich, a man of few words, would simply show them. He would point to the soldered seam, tap the dry tin, and then lead them inside to feel the calm, draft-free warmth. He explained in his simple, direct way that the enemy was not the cold, but the damp. "Keep the logs dry," he would say, "like a good roof. What the rain cannot get under, the cold cannot get through." The news of the German tin cabin spread through the logging camps and settlements of northern Wisconsin. That spring, it reached Milwaukee, and the ears of a pastor involved with the German Lutheran Hilfsverein, an aid society dedicated to helping new immigrants from the old country survive and thrive. The society was constantly battling the deadly ignorance of new arrivals who were unprepared for the ferocity of a Midwestern winter. They published pamphlets with practical advice on everything from planting seasons to treating frostbite. Intrigued, the pastor sent a representative, a young engineer, to Iron River. The engineer spent 2 days with Friedrich, sketching, measuring, and listening. He was astounded. Vogt had, with the simple tools of his trade, created a near-perfect building envelope, a concept that was decades ahead of its time. He returned to Milwaukee and drew up a formal diagram of Vogt's method: the lapped tar paper, the precise 1.5-inch overlap on the tin sheets, and the crucial technique for the lap-soldered seam. The diagram, titled "A Method for a Dry and Warm Winter Dwelling," was added to the Hilfsverein's Winter Readiness pamphlet. By the autumn of 1889, that pamphlet was being pressed into the hands of German families in immigrant orientation halls in Milwaukee, Chicago, and St. Paul. The knowledge of one quiet smith was becoming the shield of hundreds. What Friedrich Vogt accomplished in the woods of Wisconsin was more than just a clever building trick. He was anticipating the core principles of modern building science by half a century. Today, we wrap our houses in sophisticated membranes like Tyvek, using special tapes to seal every seam. We talk about air barriers and vapor barriers as if they are modern inventions. But in 1888, a German metalworker, using nothing but tin, tar paper, and a hot iron, created an envelope so effective it would meet the demanding passive house standards of the 21st century. His soldered tin skin was the direct ancestor of the fully taped high-performance wall systems that are now the gold standard in cold climate construction. He didn't have the vocabulary of R values or dew points, but he had a deeper, more tactile understanding earned through his trade: the integrity of a seam. There is a profound lesson in Friedrich Vogt's story, one that echoes the simple theme he lived by. What the rain couldn't get under, the cold couldn't either. One seam sealed 2 seasons. His genius wasn't the invention of a new material, but the application of an old principle in a new context. He saw that the forces trying to drive water through a roof were the same forces trying to drive heat out of a wall. It was all a matter of infiltration. By focusing with absolute rigor on the integrity of the seam, he solved both problems at once. The frontier didn't reward credentials or tradition. It didn't care where you came from or what language you spoke. It rewarded what worked. And in the brutal winter of 1888, what worked was the quiet, methodical perfection of a man who knew that the strongest wall is not the thickest, but the one that is most perfectly sealed. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical building science valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content that uncovers the forgotten wisdom of the past. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen an old technique that outperforms a modern one. We read every one. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.